Period 6, so we've now made our little run through the big concepts of all 5 periods, and today we're gonna wrap it up. Obviously, what we talk about in the next 45 minutes or so does not compensate for everything that's covered in the AP curriculum. We're just kind of running through big ideas again. And hopefully by sitting through these that you guys have over the last few weeks, you are better able to conceptualize not only big ideas, but when the big ideas are happening in relation to other things. That's kind of a big idea. That's the notion of periodization. So we can make sure we're dropping things in the appropriate time period with other things. We want to have people stop talking about the Mongols in the classical period, for example. So today, there are 3 sections of the 6th period of AP World curriculum. It starts off with science and tech, but I'm gonna save that. I think possibly for last today, and I want to start with the conflicts and consequences. Now, obviously, the 20th century, we live a lot with major global conflicts. World War I and World War II are the 2 biggest wars that humankind has ever fought, right? World War I, looking at like 10, 11 million people getting killed, mostly in Europe. World War II, that number is going to grow to 60 million people, and that war is going to spread not only encompassing Europe, but also Asia as well. So these are the 2 biggest conflicts that we've ever fought. What is more important, though, for AP World is the consequences that come from these conflicts, all right? So we're going to talk very briefly about the causes of the conflict, starting with World War I, and then really World War I and its effects ends up being a cause for World War II. But we're going to spend most of our time in our brief discussion today talking about the consequences of these 20th century conflicts. So first, with World War I want you to remember the main causes, that acronym: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. Sure. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. These are what we would consider the long-term causes to the development of that conflict that starts in 1914 that we call World War I. Countries were growing bigger militaries, right? And they were in military competitions, really, arms races, early forms of arms races against their rivals. Particularly Britain and Germany were both competing in the growth of navies, right, in the lead up to World War I. Alliances. Nations recognized with the growing militaries that they and their adversaries would have had that you might not be able to win a fight if it's just you. So it's good to go out and get some friends that can back you up. So there would be the formation of the alliance system in the years leading up to World War I. Imperialism, and then I'd also, notice that's an I letter, I also want you to think of the Industrial Revolution, industrialization, as another long-term cause of the First World War. There's no militarism, really, without industrialization, right? You can't mass-produce armies on the scale that we have in World War I without an Industrial Revolution allowing us to mass-produce that equipment, right? But imperialism, the growth of European empires and the elbow bumping that these European countries would do with each other in their quest to create empires. They'd run into each other, and it would spread European conflicts and European rivalries to Africa, for example, and it would create a new sore spot that these European countries would have overseas. And then nationalism. And nationalism, I think, like if I were to put one above any of the others, I think nationalism is that concept that we most have to understand. Born in the 19th century, born in the 1800s, but leading to tremendous international conflict by the 20th century. And then by the later 20th century, leading to independence movements and other things that we certainly wouldn't recognize as being like global negatives, right? But nationalism is huge. I like to think of 2 different types of nationalism. I want you to have these ideas in the back of your head. There's the German or the French or the British nationalism that fuels their international rivalries where they say, we're German or we're Britain or we're France and we are superior to our neighbors. And let's not forget about what's going on in Asia, because Japan would be saying the exact same thing. The Chinese have long said that exact same thing. We are what we are and we're better than all the people that are around us, right? That's one aspect of nationalism. A second aspect of nationalism that will contribute to the coming of the First World War is that nationalism of the people that don't have their own countries yet. Please remember one of the big themes of period 4 and 5, so we're talking after 1450, but certainly 1750 to 1900, is the growth of empires, right? The expansion of empires. And we might talk about empires like the Russian Empire, or the British Empire, or the French Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, or a Chinese Empire, whatever empires we're talking about growing. When they expand, they're going to be bringing people into their empires that are not like the ruling people, right? They're bringing foreigners that never lived in that empire until that empire expanded and brought them in, right? But with the advent of the idea, the concept of nationalism, the notion that a people in the 19th century can and even should, and this comes from Enlightenment ideas, can and even should have their own country. A people should have a right to rule themselves, or a phrase we should think of is self-determination, to decide for yourselves how you want to be ruled. This concept is an Enlightenment idea that gets picked up on by many countries in the late 18th and early 19th century. The French Revolution is based on a lot of these ideas, that the country of France is made up of French citizens of a nation, rather than just subjects of a king that can dictate to them, right? So as this idea of nationalism grows, the idea that people should have a right to decide for themselves how they want to live, how they want to be ruled, it's not going to be just for Germans or French or British people who have their own countries. It's going to be for also these people that long for their own countries. And in the story of World War I, we're going to go to some Serbian people. Serbia is a really interesting case. In the early 19th century and before, Serbia, a little country in southeastern Europe, Serbia was a part of an empire, right? What empire? Ottoman Empire. Very good. Serbia was a part of the Ottoman Empire. And as the Ottoman Empire was weakening, they didn't have as much income because Europeans were avoiding them as they traded in the Indian Ocean directly now. As the Ottoman Empire was slow to industrialize because their Janissary Corps, the traditional power positions in the Ottoman Empire, resisted a lot of that modernization. As the Ottoman Empire was weakening, we called it the sick man of Europe, right? Some national groups, some nationalities that were dominated by the Ottoman Empire, that were a part of the Ottoman Empire, would move to break free from that. And we talked about the Greeks and we talked about the Serbians as a couple examples of independence movements early on, right? A little bit of a highlight of all the stuff that's going to come later in the 20th century for the more powerful empires. Guys, it's a pattern. It makes sense, right? Where you have a powerful state that becomes a powerful empire, and they conquer other people. But through one reason or another, that empire would start to weaken. Maybe internal problems, poor leadership, corruption, economic problems, drought, floods, environmental issues, whatever. Or maybe outside pressures, right? Outside invasions or outside countries interfering in the operation of that country. Whatever it might be. Empires grow, empires get strong, they expand, they bring more people into their realm, and then they contract. And they start to have less ability to keep outsiders out or keep the lands that they've conquered in. Yes? If you want to use that phrase, dynastic cycle, now that specifically regards to China. But we really see that happening throughout the world. Very good. So the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century is losing, or early 19th century even, is losing Greece, and they're going to lose Serbia. And as we fast forward to the 20th century, some Serbian people don't live in Serbia. Some Serbian people are now living in a newer empire called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria-Hungary. And the start of World War I, like that immediate short-term cause of World War I, is the assassination of the heir apparent, the next guy to be the emperor of Austria-Hungary, a guy named Franz Ferdinand. It's not important for AP World to know his name, but just recognize it's an assassination. But why is it an assassination? Because it's a nationalist movement. It's a group of nationalists that want all Serbs to be a part of one Serbian nation. And it is because of that nationalist drive that this assassination takes place. Now, one note, I mentioned this in my classes, but across these people, you guys may or may not have talked about it. Today, we look at World War I as a tremendous tragedy, right? It's horrid, and the death and destruction that it brings, especially when you consider that World War II probably wouldn't have happened had World War I not happened. And most of the people in the West will look at that assassin, that man named Gavrilo Princip, who shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand. We would look at him as a terrorist, like his organization, known as the Black Hand, is considered in Western historical literature as a Serbian nationalist terrorist group. They murdered a political leader for political reasons. It's a terrorist group, right? But in what becomes Yugoslavia, in today present-day Serbia, in the city of Belgrade, the city where this assassination took place, which is the capital of Serbia, in that part of the world, Gavrilo Princip is a hero. And there's a monument to him. The bridge where this assassination took place in Belgrade is now named after that guy. So he is considered a national hero because he and his action would ultimately contribute to the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and ultimately the unification of all of these Serbian people and other Slavic people into a new country. Anyhow, so we've got militarism and alliances and imperialism / industrialization and nationalism as long-term causes of the First World War. Then we're going to have a First World War. That's all we're going to talk about today. Guess what? There is a First World War. It's nasty. It goes from 1914 to 1918. And by the time we get to the end of 1918, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, that's when the armistice is signed. We celebrate Veterans Day on that same day now. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, World War I comes to an end. What's more important about World War I, though, is the consequences of that conflict. After World War I, the victorious powers and Germany, the loser in the war, gets dragged to Paris for a peace conference known as the Paris Peace Conference. And at that Paris Peace Conference, over many months in early 1919, pardon me, I'm going to die. The Treaty of Versailles is written up, and the Germans are forced to sign on to the Treaty of Versailles. This is a treaty that officially ends the First World War, but Germany was forced to sign onto it. We would today use the word duress. Germany had to sign this under duress. Yes?
Would you compare this to the unequal treaties?
I think that would be a great comparison to compare this to the unequal treaties that the British or the Americans made the Chinese or the Japanese sign in the mid-19th century. Very good. So this is a treaty that was very much dictated to Germany. Germany had to sign it. Now, if Germany didn't like it, why did they sign it? Well, if you don't sign the treaty to end the war still goes on, right? And Germany was going to lose, and they were going to lose even worse had they waited to sign it later. So Germany is going to suffer a lot of punishments. One of the punishments that Germany suffers is the end of their empire. So one big consequence of World War I is the end of some empires. The German Empire, kaput. And as a side note, World War I, the Russian Empire, kaput, done, broken. The Ottoman Empire, done. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, done. So World War I brings an end to many empires, not all empires. Because the winners of World War II, Britain, France, the winners of World War I, Britain, France, their empires are actually going to grow. They're going to take some land of the Ottomans, for example, and the Germans that they gave up in Africa or in the Middle East. So one consequence is the breakup of empires. Another consequence of this war is that Germany was forced to demilitarize. Germany had to get rid of almost all of their military. Their army could only have 100,000 guys in it. They had no more ability to have a navy or an air force. This will be a part of the lead up to World War II. As another major consequence to the end of World War I, the victors of that war, Britain, France, United States, are going to look for a way to avoid having another war like that ever take place. And they will look at the idea that nationalism, like fervent nationalism, this belief that Germans were superior and they could dominate Europe, that nationalism was a contributing factor to the First World War, their solution to avoid the next World War is not be nationalist anymore, but to make a move towards internationalism. And this move towards internationalism, countries working together rather than just competing with each other, will give birth to a new international organization called the League of Nations. Do not confuse the League of Nations with the United Nations. Those two words come in alphabetical order. So please remember the League of Nations comes first, the United Nations comes second. And the United Nations is the one we still live with today. The League of Nations is an attempt to give nations of the world an international forum so they could talk out their problems, all right, and hopefully avoid any kind of conflict going forward. Problem is, there's no real way for the League of Nations to enforce anything that it would want to do if individual countries don't go along with it. So if some country is violating the orders of the League of Nations, the only way to stop them would be for League of Nations countries to decide to give some military power to that league, because it had nothing on its own. And as we're going to see, the League will never really decide to do that. So one of the consequences of World War I is this move towards internationalism, to countries working together. Another major consequence of World War I was levying crippling reparations onto Germany. A reparation is making Germany repay to repair the countries that it had invaded in World War I. So Belgium and France and Britain obviously wasn't invaded, but they lost a lot to this war. Germany had to make payments to these countries that had won World War I. This is going to set Germany up for having a crippled economy in the years going forward, which is going to allow Germany to have some radical ideas, some radical political movements take hold, because Germany is going to be so bitter and so frustrated and so economically crippled that it's going to allow radical ideas to take a little shape. All right. Another consequence of the First World War is economic, and I want to kind of link this to the Great Depression, the coming of the Great Depression. World War I in and of itself does nothing to cause the Great Depression. But some of the effects of World War I, I think, we could say, contributes to the cause of the Great Depression. For example, during World War I, we get involved, right? But we take a little while to get involved. In the first couple of years of World War I, the United States is classically the country that shows up late to the party, right? World War I starts in 1914. The United States doesn't declare war until the spring of 1917. World War II starts in 1939. The United States doesn't declare war until we get attacked by Japan in December of 1941. So we joined both of these world wars well after they have begun, right? But at the beginning of World War I and at the beginning of World War II, we are taking part. We're selling to people. We're trying to make money off of these conflicts, especially World War I. So we are very willing to provide arms and material and food to the European countries that are fighting in World War I. And then throughout the duration of the war, Russia is destroyed. The western part of Russia destroyed by World War I. The countryside of France, northeastern France, Belgium, destroyed by World War I. So all those farms and all that production that might have been happening in those countries, it really lags. But American farms weren't touched, and American production wasn't touched by the war. So in the United States, we go through an economic boom because of World War I, right? Our economy is doing great. And not only are we doing great ourselves, but we're able to contribute to what Europe needs, both during and after the war, right? And so our factories are humming in the 1920s. We call this the Roaring Twenties. You guys remember that last year in APUSH? We're doing really well in 1920s, right? And companies are growing, and farmers are buying more land, and they're producing more agriculture. But then by the time we start getting to the mid to certainly the late 1920s, European farms are producing again. European factories are producing again. And we start to find a problem of overproduction in the American economy, right? And when goods are being overproduced, what happens to the price of those goods? They start to plummet. And then those business people and those farmers have a hard time paying off the loans that they had taken to grow their businesses. And this will be a contributing factor to the onset of the stock market crash and ultimately the Great Depression. All right? When the Great Depression hits, this takes the economic problems that happened in the immediate aftermath of World War I and magnifies them. All right? This is going to be an economic disaster for any countries that do business with each other on an international scale, which is pretty much the United States and Britain and France and Germany and Italy. Any countries that do business with each other are going to be hit by the Great Depression, right? And so the Great Depression is going to have some negative consequences, obviously. The United States, unemployment's going to skyrocket. Right? People can't pay their bills. They're going to go bankrupt. Banks themselves are going to go bankrupt. Banks can't give people their money back because the banks don't have that money anymore. So it is an economic disaster. And one response to this Great Depression by the United States and then followed by other countries is going to be to try to protect its own economy. We're going to become more protectionist, right? We are going to look out for ourselves. We hear the same rhetoric today, right? We need to look out for America. America first is one of Donald Trump's campaign slogans, right? So we need to look out for ourselves before we can concern ourselves with the world's problems. And in the onset of the Great Depression, the United States responded to this depression with some protectionist policies. Think the things that we did during the mercantilist era to protect our own economies. We put huge tariffs. We passed a new tariff bill. For AP World, you don't need to know it, but you guys were in APUSH, so you remember the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, right? So we put a massive tariff. It's a tax on imported goods, right? And when we put that tax on imported goods, what do other countries then decide they need to do? Put a tax on their imported goods. And then the world stops trading with each other quite as much, right? Because everybody's becoming more protectionist of their own economies. And this is going to have an immediate impact on a little tiny resource needy nation of Japan. I shouldn't say little tiny, but it's a big country, but limited in natural resources. And Japan has long relied on trade with the United States for products like steel and oil. And those are the products that drive a modern economy. And so Japan is going to do in 1931 what Britain and France and the United States and Germany had done in the 19th century. What do you do when you want to, when you need resources? If you think your resources are limited and you want to be an industrial power, what do? You go get them. You become imperialistic, right? And please remember what was the causes of World War I. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, right? Well, the Japanese, as it lead up to World War II, the Japanese have the nationalism. The Japanese are going to have the alliances because they're going to join an alliance with Germany and Italy. The Japanese need to become imperialistic because they want to industrialize more. And to be imperialistic, you got to build your military. You've got to be able to conquer lands. So all of those long-term causes for World War I, they repeat themselves for World War II. And in 1931, Japan is going to invade Manchuria. And the League of Nations, which was supposed to stop stuff like this from happening, says, no, Japan, don't invade Manchuria. That's not cool. And what does Japan say to the League of Nations? Yeah, what are you going to do about it? And what are they going to do about it? Nothing. Because to do something about it requires the individual members of the League of Nations to give some arms, to send an army. And are Britain and France going to send armies to defend Manchurians from Japanese in 1931? No. They hate war. War sucks. War is the worst. They especially hate war, because in the 1930s there's a lot of racism going on. They especially would hate wars that don't directly impact them. And it would sacrifice British and French lives for that of Manchurians. That ain't going to happen. So instead of leaving Manchuria, Japan leaves the League of Nations, right? And then they're going to be an inspiration for a country like Italy to do the same thing to Abyssinia. Ethiopia was the last country to remain independent following the scramble for Africa. And now in 1936, Italy's going to invade Ethiopia. The League of Nations says, cut it out. And Italy says, I will cut it out, it being Italy and out of the League of Nations. What? I don't know. We've got to work on that. That's bad. But they're going to leave the League of Nations themselves. And this is also going to lead to a country like Germany, who is now, because of their economic problems that are exacerbated by the Great Depression, going to vote into power essentially a fringe party, a minority party called the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler. And by the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler, first the Chancellor of Germany, and then when the President of Germany dies, he's going to proclaim himself the Chancellor and President all in one. He calls it the leader, der Führer. Adolf Hitler will say, well, we can leave the League of Nations too. We'll do it as well. So this international organization put together to maintain world peace has now completely fallen apart, right? And then Japan continues to try to expand. Germany is going to continue to try to expand. Why do they want to expand? Resources, right? It's an economic thing. They feel they need more resources, and that's what countries were doing in the 19th century. Why was it cool for Britain to do it, or France to do it, or America to do it in the 19th century, but now it's not cool for Germany and Japan to do it? Exactly. Those are new rules we made up, right? But Germany and Japan will attempt to expand further, and then this leads to a Second World War, all right? Again, we care far less about the actual war than now the consequences of that war. The consequences of the Second World War are, I think, much more important than the first. The Second World War is World War I on steroids, right? 60 million people in Europe and Asia being killed in the Second World War. Disastrous conflict, right? After the First World War, the United States was kind of like, all right, we don't want to get involved in any of your European problems anymore. We want to mind our own business. We have an Atlantic Ocean to our east and a Pacific Ocean to our west. We don't need to trouble ourselves with what you guys are up to in Europe. We're just going to chill here in our hemisphere, right? World War II convinced Americans that technology had changed so much that we can't just bury our head in the sand anymore. Japan attacked the United States. The United States has an empire. Japan attacked the United States empire. They attacked us at Hawaii, right? And so the oceans won't protect us anymore. And so after World War I, the United States said, Europe, you do your own thing. We never joined the League of Nations. It was our president's idea. Woodrow Wilson was our president, came up with the idea of the League of Nations. Yet our Senate never approved that treaty. But after World War II, the United States will never again, or at least we think, never again abandon some kind of greater responsibility to the world. After World War II, the United States is one of the only two remaining superpowers of the world, along with the Soviet Union. Right? Powerful nations with strong economies and strong military capabilities. The United States is really it after World War II. And we decide the best way to maintain security in a post-World War II world is the United States taking part in it. So the League of Nations is created after World War I. The United States never joins it. The United Nations is created during the end of World War II and comes into fruition after World War II. We are a founding member of that. All right? The major consequence of the end of World War II, though, is the division of the world into two camps, or at least the division of Europe at the start. Division of Europe into two camps. Either Soviet Union, and those are all the countries that the Soviet Union liberated from Nazi Germany, or the Western democratic capitalist world led by the United States, which is those countries that the United States and Britain and to a lesser extent France liberated at the end of World War II. We're looking at pretty much Western Europe versus Eastern Europe, or what we could collectively now call the West, which is Western Europe and the United States, and the East, Eastern Europe, and then soon to be East Asia as well coming into the scene. So now we have a Cold War conflict. The Cold War is an ideological conflict. It is a conflict that fortunately never actually turns into a war, because it's long been said that the next war, World War III, will be fought with nuclear weapons, because we developed nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. That the next war will be fought with nuclear weapons, and then following that, the next war will be fought with sticks and stones. This idea that World War IV, if it were ever going to happen, would be like rewinding the clock to the earliest days of human civilization, where we would kind of go back to rudimentary technologies and tools because we would destroy everything, right? And so because the weapons are getting so nasty, we develop atomic bombs at the end of World War II, and we use them against Japan twice. And then the Soviet Union develops their bomb in 1949, and then we develop bigger bombs in 1952, and the Soviets develop a bigger bomb in 1953, and then we kind of go back and forth competing with each other in now a nuclear arms race. The fear that the weapons got so nasty that we would never actually want to use them because we could literally destroy ourselves by using them. So this is why the Cold War really becomes an ideological conflict rather than an actual military conflict. We are competing ideologies. The United States, Western democratic capitalism. The idea that there should be more free trade between countries, and that countries that trade together don't go to war together. World War I and World War II taught us this, right? After World War II, or like after the Great Depression, during the Great Depression, we cut off trade with a lot of countries, right? We restricted trade. And that opened the door for these countries to have conflict. After World War II, the United States was trying to sell the idea that the more trade that can happen between countries, the more countries economically rely on each other, the less likely we are to get in conflicts with them. Whereas on the flip side, the Soviet Union said, whoa, that's not how we're going to be safe and secure. Because the Soviet Union doesn't believe in global capitalism, they believe in communism. And communism not just for the Soviet Union, but a worldwide communist revolution. This is kind of what the Soviets wanted. And they believed security was going to come not through the spread of trade, but security will come through the Soviet Union actually conquering land, actually controlling territory. Please remember, different from the United States. In World War I, the United States chose to join. In World War II, the United States was attacked, but then ultimately got involved in the European and Pacific fronts, right? The Soviet Union was invaded both in World War I and in World War II. And it was particularly devastating war for the Soviet Union. No country lost more people in World War II besides China and Asia. All right? And no country besides Poland in Europe is going to lose a bigger percentage of its population in the Second World War than the Soviet Union. That war is devastating. And nobody killed more Nazis, killed more Germans in World War II than the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union sees the end of World War II and says, the way we solve our future security issues is by taking land. If we have our armies in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, even in Germany, if we have our armies there, and then we help set up friendly communist governments in those countries, then they'll never invade us. They'll be on our side. The way to avoid, it's kind of like if you can't beat them, join them. If you don't want to be beat by them, make them join you. Like grow your communist empire. And that's what the Soviet Union does. Problem is, the Soviet communist world does not mesh, cannot really coexist very well with the American capitalist world. For every country that comes under the Soviets' communist thumb, that is one less country the United States can freely trade with. And remember, we think security comes from being able to trade and do business with more people. And then we also have like these ideas that we like democracy. We like the idea that people get to vote in elections as long as they're going to vote for the people we like. That's a side. We'll talk about that in IB history. But we like the idea of democratic republics. And the Soviet Union is a dictatorship. It's a one-party communist dictatorship. We don't like that notion very much. And so this is an ideological conflict that will stretch from 1945, the end of World War II, all the way to 1991, the end of the Soviet Union. As a part of this ideological conflict, there are a few what we call proxy wars, like wars that take place within the Cold War. Maybe the U.S. is leading one of them or supporting one war, or the Soviets are supporting one war. But neither the U.S. nor the Soviets would ever fight with each other. The Korean War would be an example of this, like us trying to stop the spread of communism and the Soviets supporting it in Korea. The Vietnam War is another example, us trying to stop the spread of the North Vietnamese communists, while the Soviet Union was aiding the North into South Vietnam. The Afghan War. In 1979, the Soviet Union will invade Afghanistan to try to protect their pro-Soviet government there. In all of these cases, these are small conflicts on the scale of 20th century wars, but they're all a part of this communist West versus Soviet, or communist East versus American-supported West. So a lot of conflicts and consequences. Another consequence of that Second World War is the development of the United Nations. So juxtapose that with the League of Nations. A new international organization. Again, still to maintain peace through what's called collective security. Countries standing together to try to keep people safe. But as you can imagine, the two most important countries, two most powerful countries in the United Nations was the U.S. and Soviet Union. Very good. And for the UN to ever maybe solve serious issues, you kind of have to have the U.S. and the Soviet Union agree to that. And are we agreeing about much of anything throughout the Cold War? Not much. So despite high hopes that the UN can be much more effective than the League of Nations, we're not really going to see that come to fruition. All right.
So students are at bus 42. Today you will be riding bus 11. So today only bus 42 will be bus 11. Thank you.
A major consequence of these 20th century wars, particularly World War II, and one that we have not mentioned yet, is the decolonization. Decolonization. The decolonization movement. If imperialism and colonization was a theme of the previous sections of AP World History, part of the 20th century, part of its period 6, is decolonization. Guys, it's the end of the story, right? European powers and some Asian powers growing, expanding, conquering people. This idea of nationalism being born based on Enlightenment ideas. But then by the time we get to the 20th century, those Enlightenment ideas are starting to be desired by more people of the world that don't have their own countries. And after World War II, European nations in particular, Britain and France, are kind of broke as a joke. And they can't effectively maintain their empires anymore. And then we sound like hypocrites. If the United States is talking about like democracy and republics and letting people decide for themselves how they want to be ruled, well, that seems hypocritical if we continue to support colonies, right, of empires. And so a strong decolonization movement is going to grow, especially starting in the mid-20th century. Some countries will gain their independence through negotiation. Some countries will gain their independence through violence. You should be able to come up with an example of either. What country is going to gain independence through negotiation? They're talking about it? India. Very good. From Britain. And many British colonies will gain their independence in much the same way. When we talk about independence through violence, we usually push towards France and the colonies of Indochina or Vietnam and Algeria in Africa. Both of these colonies would rise up in violent rebellion to the French. And they would both ultimately win. Yes, ma'am?
So can you say like Enlightenment ideals live a continuity over time?
I would not say Enlightenment ideals are a continuity over all time, but once the Enlightenment happens, once we have these ideas that a people have like a right to have a political voice, that we have a right to our own lives and freedom, once those ideas exist, they're going to exist through the Enlightenment period, through the 19th century, and certainly into the 20th century, linking up a lot of these places. And as we talked in my class, please recognize a guy like the Indian independence movement, led by a guy like Mohandas Gandhi. The Indian independence movement was an enlightened movement. He was Western educated, like many other leaders of the Indian independence movement. They studied in the West. They read Enlightenment thinking. And they said, well, why don't we get this too? And they use a lot of that thinking and training to advocate for their own independence. Ho Chi Minh, I think we read a little excerpt from the Declaration of Independence from Vietnam. He said his opening lines to the Declaration of Independence for Vietnam was, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That is Thomas Jefferson's line. And Thomas Jefferson was only copying John Locke's lines, right? Obviously an original Enlightenment thinker. So please recognize the decolonization movement. It's going to happen in South Asia. It's going to happen in Southeast Asia. Going to happen in Africa. So this trend of history where much of the world had been colonized and dominated by Western European powers, it's going to fall apart in the late 19th century. All right? Or pardon me, late 20th century. Okay, I want to talk about a couple important sci-tech things. I don't think we need to dwell on this because this is your lives, guys. Please don't, especially when you're dealing with these period 6 questions, don't forget to recognize that you guys are really living in period 6 of AP World History. The world we live in now is like the end effect of all of these developments of the 20th century. So the fact that we, like this is getting recorded right now, and this is going to be thrown onto YouTube by tonight, and that people around the country are going to be watching this video, this is an impact of modern communication, how effectively and fast we can communicate, right? Or the fact that most of you guys in this room now have traveled not only outside of our state, our local region, but you've traveled, many of you, outside of the country. Raise your hand if you've been outside of our country. My gosh, almost everybody. I'm with you. Oh, then I'm the only one. Besides Canada. Canada counts. But we've been able to do this because transportation and communication technologies have so dramatically improved and connected the world. A line that's often used, I don't know why I need to draw it, but the world used to look like that, now the world looks like that, right? The world figuratively got smaller because we are so much more connected. We're interconnected like we've never been before. Most of you could go home and stare at your phone for the next hour or two after you get home, and a phone is going to ring, and you're going to pick it up, and it's going to be someone calling you from India. And it could be a relative for some of you, but it's probably going to be someone that's telling you that you need to contact the IRS really quickly because they are on to you, and they need to have you report some financial information to stay out of jail, right? So the world is so much more connected. Your families work jobs overseas. Sometimes they have to travel outside of our country to do that very work, right? So think of the new tech, and I love to juxtapose this with what we talked about in period 5. In period 5, we've got like a railroad connecting communities and connecting regions like they'd never been connected before. In period 6, we've got automobiles and highways. In period 5, we've got a telegraph, right? Where we can send an electric signal along a wire that is even going to connect continents, right? Europe and North America will be connected via telegraph wires. In period 6, we go to the telephone, and then later the internet as a communication and business tool. The airplane as another transportation and development. Obviously, we've already gone from sail ships pre-19th century to steamships in the 20th century, and now we have ships that with like diesel engines, right? Now we have nuclear submarines and nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that can stay in the ocean for months at a time without ever refueling, right? They'll virtually never have. All they have to refuel, ironically enough, on those ships is not the ship itself, but the people that are on those ships. So a lot of new scientific and technological developments that are going to tremendously impact the way we can communicate with each other, both in speed and amount. Also, the 20th century, we want to talk about advancements in medicine, right? Our understanding of diseases and how sicknesses happen and how we can solve those problems. We're going to have polio vaccines, and we're going to have measles vaccines, and we're going to have smallpox vaccines. So these things don't impact us like they once did. Remember, the entire course of world history has been spent trying to avoid nasty diseases. And in the 20th century, we start solving some of them, right? Not all of them. Keep in mind, we survive so many diseases now that we live into a much older age, which gives us the opportunity to run into other health problems. In the Western world, things like heart disease and diabetes really causes us a lot of problems. And heart disease in and of itself is really a disease that we get because, one, we survive, and two, we tend to consume a lot of things that aren't that hot for us without having a lot of physical activity, right? People in earlier generations of humanity, they made most of their livings by going out and working in physically demanding labor. They're getting exercise just by their very work. Today, many of us work by sitting at a desk all day long, right? We don't even, many of us don't have to travel for business anymore. We just do it all remotely, right? We connect, we don't even have to leave our houses for work. Any of your folks don't have to leave their homes for many days of the week because they can just communicate with their offices through the internet. It's high tech, right? So new diseases are going to pop on the scene that we have to deal with. Cancer rates. Cancer is not a new disease, but we've solved so many other things that people used to die from. Now cancer is a much bigger issue than we had ever dealt with before. In the developing world, HIV and AIDS, human immunovirus and acquired immune deficiency syndrome, the virus and then ultimately the disease that you can that'll get you from that virus. This will be a new disease that we have to deal with in the later part of the 20th century, Particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, it's going to be an issue, which is going to cause tremendous demographic effects as the population of young people starts to get squeezed while we have to maintain a population of older. Last thing I want to talk about is the Green Revolution. Please remember the Green Revolution. This is technology, science and technology applied to the field of agriculture. Starting in the mid-20th century. We will start using some of our scientific and technological knowledge to improve the production of agricultural products. It's weird language. We farm more, and we farm better. Today, the United States farms more food on less land than we did 75 years ago, because we're just that much better at farming. And so the Green Revolution is going to allow the world to exist today with 7.5 billion people on it, when you guys know now a little bit about Thomas Malthus from reading Brave New World, when Thomas Malthus said if the world ever got to over 1 billion people, we would all be dying and starving and fighting in constant war over limited food supplies. Problem is, this is a lot of good news, sci-tech stuff, right? But this human population that's grown to 7.5 billion people causes tremendous pollution. We create a lot of waste. We need a lot of resources. We consume a lot of energy that can contribute to global climate change, global warming. We chop down a lot of trees in our forest lands around the world. We have limited freshwater resources, and much of the freshwater that we have, we've polluted it. So please recognize the environmental costs that come with having a population around the world of 7.5 billion people. All right, I want to hop over to this social, economic, cultural area. There's a lot of problems and a lot of challenges in the 20th century that we absolutely have to deal with, right? Different countries, depending on where you are, and then sometimes international organizations have tried to deal with some of these problems. In the communist world, communism in and of itself is trying to solve an economic problem that they see in capitalism. If you're a communist, you look at the Great Depression as the result of ineffective capitalist economic policies. And so you want to spread communist ideology around the world. You want to rapidly industrialize. You want to collectivize your farms. You want to nationalize your industry. And you want to spread a communist ideology as far as you can spread it. In the Western world, we've had to have some reactions to economic problems. And we do this in large part by, again, our own government taking a bigger role in trying to solve economic problems. Franklin Roosevelt was a president that attempted to deal with the problems of the Great Depression by growing the size of the American federal government. That the government could solve many economic problems in the United States. This was called his New Deal. Prior to the New Deal in the United States, prior to Franklin Roosevelt, most Americans didn't have any part to play with their federal government. We were very much more connected to our state and our local governments. But today, every single one of your grandparents or great-grandparents probably gets Social Security checks in the mail. That's the federal government giving them some money. Social welfare programs to try to help out when citizens have issues. Medicare and Medicaid programs, providing health care for citizens. The New Deal also provided a lot of jobs in the construction of buildings and roads and dams around our country. This idea that the federal government has a responsibility to try to improve the economic conditions in the nation. That happened in the Western world, in the United States in particular. With regard to some other organizations and some other ideas that are going to grow in the 20th century to try to solve some of the world's problems, new international trade and economic organizations will grow. The World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. These are international economic organizations meant to try to help out to improve economic problems, especially in the developing world, the poorer countries of the world. Yes? Social problems are usually problems between people. Whenever we talk, and that's a great point to leave, and I want to talk about that in a second. Make sure we're all comfortable with politics and society and cultural and economic. There is certainly overlap between a lot of these. But whenever we're talking social issues, we're usually dealing with things like social classes or gender relations, how people interact with each other. And now certainly, like we've even jumbled these two words together to create a new word like socioeconomic status. What is your social and economic class? Where does that put you, right? So they're very much related, but economic usually deals with finances and trade and jobs and taxes and things like that, where social issues are people's interactions, right? So we've created international organizations to try to improve economic conditions around the world. Some countries have joined together in economic agreements in order to try to facilitate more trade between their countries. In Europe, that's what the European Union is all about. In the United States, we've developed a trade agreement with other North American nations called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, to try to improve trade relations between American countries. We've already talked about the United Nations as an improvement over the former League of Nations, right? These are all big organizations that attempt to solve some of the world's political or economic problems. Sometimes, though, there aren't powerful international organizations that can solve a people's problem. And so people have made movements of their own to try to rectify some of these issues. I want to talk about South Africa really quickly and the apartheid movement. Apartheid in South Africa was this separatist movement where the white people of South Africa who controlled the economy and the government created laws to separate themselves from the black people of South Africa. That was the majority of the population. Kind of like America's Jim Crow laws in the late 19th century and early 20th century, first half of the 20th century. Laws meant to keep the races separate. While in South Africa, an active anti-apartheid movement would grow, arguing for equality in South Africa. And this would spread around the world. And it was very much nonviolent, and this would spread around the world. Ultimately, by the 1990s, bringing an end to South Africa's practice of apartheid. Some other movements have not seen peaceful resistance as their way to get what they want. Some movements have used violence. Today, we use the word terrorism to mean violence in the cause of a political idea. All right? So any organization or any group that is using violence to try to reach some political end is a terrorist group, right? That's the language we use. But they're still trying to bring change, even if we may not agree with that particular change or certainly the method that they're using. That's what they're doing. And we see this phenomenon in the late 20th century. We see it in a couple different areas. In England, or in Ireland, Northern Ireland, what is called the Irish Republican Army is going to use political violence against the government of England to try to get independence for Northern Ireland. And then what touched the United States on September 11th, a group called Al-Qaeda. This is Osama bin Laden's network, terrorist network, that is going to obviously bring tremendous political violence to the United States in order to try to drive the United States out of the Middle East. So these organizations absolutely still exist. And today, the organizations like the United Nations are actively working together to try to limit the threats of organizations like these. There's definitely more within period 6. This was not all. But we just kind of ran through some big ones. Oh, the last bit, let me link up the sci-tech with the cultural stuff. As the world has become more connected, as communication and as the internet has been developed, the world's culture is starting to solidify. Do you guys know how we do those, like when you're little kids, and maybe we still have some remnants of it still that we see, like when there's a cultural day at school, we tend to see people, like little kids getting dressed up in maybe traditional outfits from their particular culture or whatever they would want to demonstrate. And the reality, people would wear traditional Spanish or traditional German or traditional Asian clothes or whatever. And they would come into school and they would show off on cultural day. And then, but if you were someone from Germany or someone from Spain or someone from Japan or China, you'd probably look at them and be like, We don't dress like that. No, like that's very traditional. That's like kind of older world. Because if you were to go to Germany, or if you were to go to France, or if you were to go to Japan, how are people dressing today? They're kind of wearing the exact same thing that we're wearing, right? And they're probably listening to the same music, and they probably just watched Avengers Infinity War, and they're doing all of the exact same stuff. Or even on the flip side, like all you crazy kids and your K-pop stuff, right? Like where now we have such easy access to hear. That's a thing, right? I didn't mess that up. That's just you? Okay. Anyway, where we have such easier access to the culture around the world. But what is K-pop? It's really, like, isn't it just, am I mistaken, but isn't it just like Korean boy bands, basically? Yeah. Like, it's Koreans kind of doing the American 1990s and early 2000s boy band thing, and it's just a replication of kind of the same cultural idea. So please make this connection, how the world has gotten smaller, and culture is very much shared. And we now go around the world and we eat the same foods and we consume the same things and we have many of the same hopes and dreams and we listen to the same cruddy music. Coolio?